Welcome to the debate. Our focus today, well, it centers on the intense political and legal maneuvers surrounding the mandated release of the Epstein Files. The administration's strategic response, we're talking extraordinary resource mobilization for redaction, fragmentation, these protracted delays. It forces us to analyze not just the scandal, but the architecture of power itself.
Exactly. And the essential conflict we have to address really is this. Do these documented actions by Donald Trump's political leadership represent a fundamental sign of, let's say, power desperation and structural erosion, suggesting weakness, maybe even collapse?
And this is the other side of it. Are they an effective, calculated, strategic deployment of confusion and endurance, designed specifically to neutralize threats and maintain political control? I'm going to argue that the visible failures of containment and the bending of procedural law, they signal fundamental structural flaws. I think it points towards systemic fragility and ultimately strategic failure.
And I'll be maintaining a different view. I believe what we are witnessing is not a sign of panic at all, but a highly effective, frankly ancient and necessary tactical response by the powerful. This is about controlling the narrative flow and weaponizing time to ensure the political leadership's long-term endurance.
When you look at the source material, it's pretty clear that this pattern of behavior, delay, obfuscation, escalation, it's exactly what history and power psychology predict when a ruler feels politically cornered. This goes way beyond standard political damage control. It is a power drama where the ruler views transparency as an existential threat, believing exposure equates to extinction. The core structural flaw here is visibility. The massive resource mobilization for delay has pulled back the curtain, and it's allowing the public to see the, quote, strings of the puppeteer. Once that mechanism of control is visible, the entire illusion of impartial power just starts to break down. And furthermore, the refusal of the immediacy that's required by the Epstein Files Transparency Act, that sets a dangerous precedent. The administration is testing the very limits of institutional power. It's essentially asking, does the law still apply when state resources are invoked to delay and obscure? If the rule of law can be bent this dramatically in a case of this moral gravity, the process of structural delegitimization just accelerates across every institution, the courts, investigative bodies, even the media.
I see what you're saying about institutional limits. I do. But I would argue that visibility is a cost the administration is perfectly willing to pay, because the strategy is focused on controlling the rate of information, not denying it absolutely. This approach is rooted in a successful power philosophy. When you're confronted with danger, and here, the danger is the loss of narrative control, confusion serves as a shield, delay is a weapon, and controlled, partial truth remains highly effective.
But do you really think it's working?
I don't buy the premise that this strategy is failing. No. It is successfully utilizing time, which, as we know, inherently favors the powerful. Time allows them to rewrite stories, to remove names, soften language, and meticulously prepare defenses for months and months. This delay doesn't signal weakness. It buys them crucial leverage, and it ensures that political enemies grow weary waiting for some big reveal that might never fully materialize. And the deliberate choice to emphasize that hundreds of thousands of documents are being handled, that's a calculated tactic. It makes the task sound so immense, it intimidates the public into thinking, oh, this is too big to be a conspiracy. The sheer scale is deployed to mask incompleteness, successfully redefining obstruction as, diligence. Normalization occurs precisely when the public is worn down, and power survives by being endured.
Okay. Let's zero in on that strategic delay. You frame it as methodological preparation. I see it as an existential test of the justice system itself. The law requires immediacy, and the refusal to comply signals that rules are negotiable based on political influence. And we can see the infrastructure that's been built to protect this elasticity. Consider the appointment of loyalists like Todd Blanche, who was Donald Trump's criminal defense attorney in a case that resulted in felony convictions. That appointment isn't merely political preference. It highlights a shared vulnerability. His history ties his personal and professional fate to the successful protection of the leadership. This level of systemic protection, loyalty purchased through shared risk, it underscores a deep-seated fear of full daylight. The system is mobilizing against accountability, defining it not as justice, but as deep betrayal against the ruler.
Okay, but let's look at the observable facts of that mobilization. Fear is often the primary driver for effective, rigorous planning. If this were a structure on the verge of collapse, what would we see? We'd see chaos, errors, quick capitulation. Instead, we see the devotion of tens of thousands of staff hours, massive overtime costs, and thousands of personnel focused purely on document preparation. That is not panic. That is methodical damage control on an industrial scale. They are editing history, removing sharp edges, and coordinating narratives amongst allies during this phased release. The high cost involved is evidence of the strategic importance they place on surviving this exposure, not evidence that the structure is failing. They are paying the price to control the timing and the battlefield.
I acknowledge the industrial nature of the damage control, but we have to interrogate the impact of that control on the source material itself. The Epstein Files. Fragmentation, this release in multiple, segmented phases, is especially dangerous here, because the subject matter involves child exploitation, which the source material rightly labels moral dynamite.
Moral dynamite is a strong term.
It is, and the protection of crimes of this moral gravity, it ignites something primal in the public consciousness, that power really struggles to survive. Fragmentation fails because the public instinctively cuts through the administrative fog and asks, what are you actively hiding right now, and why are you willing to bend the law to protect it? This systematic segmentation to protect names, networks, and patterns causes a rapid, visible erosion of institutional legitimacy.
That's a compelling point about the inherent moral volatility of the files, but fragmentation is a dark, yet highly effective insight from political philosophy, precisely because it exhausts moral outrage. When the truth or fragments of it is delivered in small, separated doses over many, many months, the initial fury just dilutes. Outrage becomes what the literature terms background noise. Power survives when people cannot react to what they cannot grasp as a coherent, structural whole. The goal here is endurance. By keeping the critical truth in its most dangerous form, the linkages, the corroboration, the systemic patterns, segmented, the public is denied the ability to reconstruct the structural dots. This strategy is designed to ensure that the immediate impact of scandal is neutralized by administrative fatigue.
Fatigue is a factor, yes, but that fatigue is compounded by glaring financial hypocrisy. This is where the structural rot becomes visible to the average citizen. We see the blending of Donald Trump's personal financial interest, mergers, massive stock surges, billion-dollar valuations, with the bending of state law regarding the Epstein Files. This is hypocrisy made visible and actionable. When political power demands patience and acceptance of delays from a public struggling with historic lows in consumer sentiment and crushing inflation, while simultaneously enriching itself dramatically by leveraging that same power, resentment ferments. And the wisdom holds that this kind of resentment unites opposition faster than visible hypocrisy alone. This is not a strategy for endurance. It's a profound self-inflicted wound to legitimacy.
I'm not convinced that the blurring of wealth and authority is viewed as a vulnerability by the political leadership. Historically, this merging is successful consolidation. Accountability becomes intolerable to the administration precisely because any challenge to its authority, including legal accountability, is framed as treason or an assault on the state itself. The political leadership isn't trying to persuade the informed opposition. It's trying to exhaust the skeptical middle ground. The constant repetition of claims like having always wanted transparency is designed to simulate truth. This turns defiance and opposition into mere routine noise. This normalization, this acceptance that wealth and state power are intertwined, is the absolute key to surviving visible hypocrisy. The goal is to make the public weary enough that the ethical violation becomes an ignorable cost of doing business.
But that normalization effort is failing because it crashes directly into the lived experience of the populace. Economic reality strips away the public's tolerance for procedural excuses. When people are deeply worried about paying rent or buying food, They have zero patience for the leadership spending vast sums of taxpayer resources on redoction to protect a network tied to profound moral violation. The source material highlights that this psychological pressure breeds political resistance. The administration's pivot toward heavy authoritarian gestures, the framing of critics as enemies, militarized language, symbolic dominance, while simultaneously violating transparency laws, that is a textbook sign of a desperate governing structure preparing for resistance, not leading with consensus. That shift from persuasion to coercion is a fundamental strategic flaw that signals defensive posturing, not stable governance.
I see why you characterize that pivot as desperation, but the leadership is highly adept at changing the subject. While economic pain is real, power strategically utilizes spectacle, such as dramatic border confrontations or highly visible seizures, and emphasizes symbolic dominance. This is a deliberate psychological positioning designed to neutralize dissent by amplifying external threats and framing all internal critics as liars or traitors. The message they successfully project is, we are strong enough to ignore the constraints of law and the demands of transparency because we are focused on protecting you from a larger existential threat. This strategic redirection successfully diffuses public anger away from the embarrassing and structurally revealing details of the Epstein files. It's an effective defense mechanism, not a sign of imminent collapse.
So, to return to my central point, the cumulative effect of the visible strategy, the refusal to comply with the spirit of the law, and this collision with undeniable economic hardship has brought us to a moment where tension has hardened into consequence. The issue isn't merely tactical, it is fundamentally structural. The question is whether our institutions are now primarily serving justice or whether they are simply protecting the mechanisms of influence. The erosion of trust caused by the systematic, visible protection of secrecy, especially regarding crimes of profound moral gravity, it pushes the entire system toward a dangerous breaking point. Power is most vulnerable precisely when the orchestration of its delay reveals the specific mechanics of its protection.
And I maintain that the administration's strategy of delay, fragmentation, and continuous attack on the interpreter of the files remains a highly sophisticated defense mechanism. The outcome is certainly not predetermined, but the political leadership is attempting to carve out a path toward normalization. They are betting heavily that public fatigue will set in before a comprehensive, fully contextualized truth can break down the door. By defining their defiance as prudence and their obstruction as diligence, they are actively working to outlast the controversy. Endurance in this high-stakes contest still favors the ruler.
What is clear, I think we both agree, is that the full, unvarnished resolution of the Epstein Files release is critical.
Absolutely. If the files are released fully, the resulting information will inevitably reorder current structures of power. If they are successfully withheld or permanently fragmented, that defiance will represent a profound and visible delegitimization of the existing authority.
There is no quiet ending to this saga, and the weight of the evidence rests on whether one views the current effort as meticulous, effective damage control, or as the final, revealing gambit of a cornered political system. We leave the listener to weigh the evidence for themselves.